There is a narrow stretch of water sitting between Oman and Iran that controls more of the global economy than most people realize. At its narrowest point, the Strait of Hormuz is only 33 kilometers wide. Through that bottleneck flows roughly 20% of all the oil traded on Earth. Every tanker heading out of Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, and the UAE has to pass through it. Every liquefied natural gas shipment leaving Qatar squeezes through that same corridor. It is the single most consequential choke point in the global energy system, and for decades, the United States Navy has been the force that kept it open. Control the Strait of Hormuz, and you control the economic bloodstream of the modern world. Everyone who depends on Middle Eastern energy, which is most of the planet, understands this at some level. But nobody has understood it more clearly or felt more exposed by it than China. China is the world's largest importer of oil. A significant portion of that oil comes from the Middle East and has to pass through Hormuz to reach Chinese ports. That means the United States Navy, simply by existing and operating in the Persian Gulf, has always held a card it could theoretically play against China in a crisis. Not necessarily by blocking Chinese tankers directly, but by operating in a position of such overwhelming dominance over the waterway that China's entire energy supply chain runs through a corridor it does not control and cannot protect. Beijing has known this for decades, and in 2026, after years of infrastructure investment, diplomatic maneuvering, and pipeline construction that most Western analysts underestimated, China has done something that is making Washington furious. It has built a way around Hormuz entirely, and the implications of that go far beyond oil. To understand why bypassing Hormuz became a strategic obsession for Chinese planners, you need to understand what Chinese strategists call the Malacca Dilemma. The Strait of Malacca, the narrow passage between Malaysia and Indonesia through which most of China's seaborne trade flows, represents a similar choke point vulnerability on the other side of the journey. Chinese energy imports travel from the Middle East, through Hormuz, across the Indian Ocean, through Malacca, and then north to Chinese ports. That route passes through two critical choke points, both of which sit outside Chinese control, and along an ocean highway that the U.S. Navy has dominated for generations. In any serious military confrontation between the United States and China, one of the first and most obvious American strategic moves would be to threaten that supply line. Not necessarily to cut it immediately, but to hold it at risk in ways that would force China to divert enormous military resources to protecting it, distract Chinese strategic attention away from other theaters, and create economic pressure that could be escalated or relieved according to American diplomatic objectives. Chinese military and energy planners identified this vulnerability clearly in the early 2000s and began designing around it with the same long-term patience that characterizes Chinese infrastructure strategy generally. The solution they arrived at was not primarily military, though military components are part of it. It was geographical. If the sea routes through Hormuz and Malacca could be controlled or threatened by outside powers, China would build land routes that could not be interdicted by naval force at all. The centerpiece of China's Hormuz bypass is a pipeline and port infrastructure network running through Pakistan that connects the Arabian Sea directly to Western China. The China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, known as CPEC, is the most strategically significant piece of infrastructure most people have never thought carefully about. It stretches roughly 3,000 kilometers from the deep water port of Gwadar on Pakistan's Balochistan coast through some of the most difficult terrain on Earth, across mountain ranges, through economically underdeveloped regions, and into China's Xinjiang province. Gwadar sits just outside the Persian Gulf. Oil loaded onto tankers in the Gulf states can be offloaded at Gwadar before it ever reaches Hormuz. From Gwadar, pipelines, roads, and rail links carry that energy overland directly into China, The route completely bypasses the Strait of Hormuz, completely bypasses the Indian Ocean choke points, and covers the distance in a time frame that is competitive with the sea route while being entirely immune to naval interdiction. China has invested tens of billions of dollars in this corridor over the past decade. The port at Gwadar has been expanded, deepened, and equipped with infrastructure capable of handling the volumes needed to make the route economically meaningful. Pipeline capacity has been built out in phases, with each phase increasing the volume of oil and gas that can move overland rather than by sea. Special economic zones along the corridor have been established to give the infrastructure economic depth beyond just the energy transit function, making the entire network harder to disrupt because more stakeholders depend on it functioning. In 2026, that infrastructure reached a threshold of operational capacity that Chinese energy planners had been working toward for years. The overland route through Pakistan is no longer a backup or an emergency option. It is a functioning alternative that carries real volumes and has the physical capacity to carry significantly more. The Pakistan corridor is only one part of the picture. China has simultaneously been developing what amounts to a northern energy bypass that runs through Russia and Central Asia, using routes that are even further from American naval power than the Pakistani corridor. The Power of Siberia pipeline, which began delivering Russian natural gas to northeastern China in 2019, has been followed by expanded agreements and additional pipeline capacity that have made Russia to China energy flows a major and growing component of Chinese energy security. Russia, under sustained Western sanctions following the invasion of Ukraine, has become deeply motivated to expand its energy relationship with China, offering terms that would have been unimaginable before 2022. The result is a Russia-China energy partnership of a scale and depth that has no recent historical precedent, built on infrastructure that runs entirely overland through territory where the United States has no military presence and no realistic ability to interdict. The Iran dimension adds another layer. China has maintained and deepened its energy relationship with Iran throughout the period of maximum Western sanctions pressure on Tehran. Chinese purchases of Iranian oil, conducted through financial arrangements specifically designed to avoid dollar-denominated transactions and Western banking systems, have kept Iranian oil revenues flowing, while simultaneously giving China access to energy supplies that are geographically close to Hormuz, but contractually and financially outside the Western-dominated system. A 25-year cooperation agreement signed between China and Iran in 2021 formalized this relationship at a scale that went well beyond previous arrangements, covering energy, infrastructure, and security cooperation in ways that effectively made Iran a node in China's alternative energy architecture. Iranian oil does not need to go through Hormuz to reach China if it moves overland, through the infrastructure being developed under that agreement. And even the portions that do move by sea travel through waters where China's growing naval presence and diplomatic relationships create a very different environment than existed a decade ago. Washington's fury about all of this is real, but it is important to be precise about what is actually driving it, because it is more than just frustration about losing an energy leverage point. The Hormuz bypass represents something that American strategic planners have been trying to prevent for decades. It is the physical manifestation of China building itself out of the corner that dollar-denominated oil trade and U.S. naval dominance had put it in. For as long as the global oil market operated primarily in dollars, and for as long as the sea routes carrying that oil ran through waters the U.S. Navy dominated, there were structural constraints on Chinese strategic autonomy that operated entirely independently of any explicit American policy decision. They were baked into the architecture of the global system. China is systematically dismantling those constraints, not by confronting them directly, but by building around them. The overland pipelines move energy outside the maritime corridors the Navy controls. The yuan-denominated oil trade deals being struck with Gulf states, Russia, and Iran move transactions outside the dollar system that gives U.S. financial policy its global reach. The port and infrastructure investments under the Belt and Road Initiative give China physical presence in locations that matter strategically, not just economically. The Hormuz bypass is the energy piece of a much larger architecture that China has been building. And energy is arguably the most fundamental piece. A country that cannot reliably power its economy, cannot project military force, cannot sustain industrial production, and cannot maintain the domestic stability that the Communist Party considers its primary obligation. Remove the Hormuz vulnerability, and you remove one of the most significant points of leverage that the United States held over Chinese strategic decision-making. Here is what makes this story considerably more complicated than a simple China versus America narrative. The countries that sit around the Persian Gulf, the ones whose oil has historically flowed through Hormuz under American protection, are not uniformly aligned with Washington's perspective on China's bypass infrastructure. Saudi Arabia has been conducting yuan-denominated oil sales to China. The UAE has been deepening financial and trade relationships with Chinese partners that operate outside dollar clearing systems. Qatar, which hosts a major American military base and is one of Washington's closest Gulf partners, has simultaneously been signing long-term LNG supply agreements with Chinese buyers that give Beijing energy security guarantees extending decades into the future. These countries are not abandoning their American security relationships. The U.S. military presence in the Gulf remains significant and valued, but they are hedging. They are diversifying. They have watched American energy policy shift as domestic shale production reduced U.S. dependence on Gulf oil, and they have drawn the rational conclusion that an America less dependent on their oil is an America with somewhat less interest in bearing the full cost of their security. China, by contrast, remains deeply dependent on their exports and has been investing heavily in relationships, infrastructure, and financial arrangements that make that dependence mutual. The Gulf states being willing to facilitate yuan-denominated energy trade with China is not a trivial development. It chips away at the petrodollar system that has underpinned American financial dominance since the 1970s. It does not collapse that system, which is deeply embedded and has enormous inertia, but it creates parallel tracks that over time reduce the singular dominance of the dollar in global energy markets. There is a military dimension to Gwadar and the broader CPEC infrastructure that Pakistani and Chinese officials describe carefully in civilian terms, but that defense analysts read very differently. The port facilities at Gwadar are built to standards that would accommodate naval vessels. The security infrastructure protecting the corridor includes capabilities that go beyond what commercial asset protection requires. Chinese military personnel are present in the region in numbers and with a profile that is somewhat inconsistent with a purely civilian infrastructure project. The United States has not accused China of operating a naval base at Gwadar, and China has consistently denied any military use of the facilities. But the distinction between a commercial port that can accommodate naval vessels and a naval base is not always as sharp as official statements suggest. And the strategic logic of building a port on the Arabian Sea, connecting it via a secured corridor to Chinese territory, and investing enormous resources in its protection, points toward a long-term vision that includes naval access, whether or not that is the official description today. If China eventually achieves a sustained naval presence in the Arabian Sea, operating from infrastructure it built and controls, the entire geometry of American naval dominance in the region shifts. The U.S. Navy's ability to use Hormuz as a lever depends partly on the assumption that China cannot effectively contest American naval operations in the waters approaching the Strait. A Chinese naval presence operating from Gwadar-adjacent facilities would complicate that assumption in ways that would require substantial American military repositioning to address. Step back from the specific corridors and choke points and look at what China has actually been building over the past 15 years, and a coherent picture emerges that is more ambitious than any individual project suggests. The Belt and Road Initiative, which Western commentary has often treated as primarily an economic development program with debt-trap dimensions, is also, and perhaps primarily, an energy security architecture. The ports, pipelines, railways, and roads being built from Central Asia through Pakistan, from Russia through Siberia, from the Middle East through Iran, from East Africa across the Indian Ocean, they all connect back to China. They all move resources toward China. And they are all deliberately routed through geography that keeps them outside the maritime corridors, where American naval power is most decisive. This is not accidental. Chinese infrastructure investment follows a logic that is simultaneously economic, diplomatic, and strategic. A port built with Chinese financing, designed by Chinese engineers, operated with Chinese management systems, and connected to Chinese logistics networks is an asset that serves Chinese strategic interests even when it is technically the sovereign property of another nation. The infrastructure creates dependencies, relationships, and access arrangements that persist and deepen over time. The Hormuz bypass that became operationally significant in 2026 was not built in response to any single crisis or confrontation. It was built through 15 years of patient investment, following a strategic logic that was clearly articulated in Chinese planning documents and consistently executed regardless of which administration sat in Washington or what the current state of U.S.-China relations happened to be. The operational reality of a functioning Hormuz bypass does not mean China is now invulnerable to energy supply disruption. The Pakistan corridor runs through a country with significant internal instability, through terrain that presents its own security challenges and depends on a bilateral relationship that has had its complications. The Russian energy relationship comes with the political costs of alignment with a country under Western sanctions. The Iranian dimension carries proliferation and regional stability risks that China has to manage alongside the energy benefits. But vulnerabilities are not the same as failure. What China has built is not a perfect alternative to the sea routes. It is a resilient architecture with enough redundancy and enough capacity that the Hormuz choke point, which once functioned as something close to an absolute constraint on Chinese strategic options, now functions as a significant inconvenience rather than a potential stranglehold. That shift in the nature of the constraint changes the strategic calculus for everyone. American planners who built Taiwan scenario models around the assumption that energy vulnerability would deter Chinese military action have to revisit those models. Gulf states calculating how much they need American protection have new variables to factor in. Regional powers whose own strategic positions were partly defined by American dominance of the sea lanes are operating in a geography that has quietly but fundamentally changed. The Strait of Hormuz is still there. The American Navy is still there. The oil still flows through it. But the leverage it represented, the structural power that came from being the guardian of a choke point that China could not route around, that has been permanently diminished by infrastructure that now exists and will not stop existing. Washington is furious, but fury does not fill in the pipelines that have already been built or empty the port that is already operational. The map changed. And in geopolitics, maps are very hard to unchange.